my God!
There is a kind of pain that does not have a proper name. Grief comes close, but grief is for the dead, and the people who caused this pain were very much alive. Betrayal comes close too, but betrayal usually implies that you trusted someone you probably shouldn't have, a stranger, a rival, someone whose loyalties were always questionable. This is something different. This is the specific, suffocating pain of having the ground pulled out from under your feet by the one person who put you on the ground in the first place, the one person who brought you into this world, the one person whose love you never thought to question, because questioning it would be like questioning gravity. It was simply the force that held everything together. This is the story of Ashley, a young woman, a new mother, a bride, a daughter who loved her mother the way daughters are supposed to love their mothers, completely, without an exit strategy, without a backup plan, without ever imagining she would need one. And this is the story of what her mother Linda actually did with that love. Linda sat in the front row at Ashley's wedding. She smiled for every single photograph. She wept during the vows, real tears witnessed by everyone in that room. She funded the entire wedding out of her own pocket. She hugged the groom at the reception and told him to take care of her daughter. She even went on the honeymoon. And 12 months later, she was carrying that groom's child, Ashley's husband, the father of Ashley's baby daughter. Linda was pregnant by him. And Ashley, the daughter she had raised from birth, the daughter she had paid a wedding for, the daughter she had stood beside and celebrated, was left completely, utterly alone. This is not a rumor. This is not fiction. This happened. It was documented, reported, and the people involved eventually gave interviews about it. And by the time this video is over, you will understand not just what happened, but how. How something this devastating is built, quietly, deliberately, one small choice at a time, right in front of someone who had no idea they needed to be watching. Before we go any further into this story, we want to stop and ask you something. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and we read every single comment on this channel. And if this is your first time here on Never Ending Deep Stories, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We release stories like this one regularly, and you do not want to be the last person to find out what we cover next. Now, let us talk about what the story is really about. Because on the surface, it sounds like a tabloid headline: Mother steals daughter's husband, has his baby, end of story. But that is not the full picture. The full picture is far more layered and far more uncomfortable than any headline can contain. The real questions this story asks are the ones that keep you up at night. Questions like, how does a woman who paid for her daughter's wedding end up pregnant by the groom? How does something like this develop right under the roof of a family and nobody sees it until it is already irreversible? Were there signs? Were there moments where someone could have said something, done something, changed the direction of what was coming? And what does it do to a person, a young woman, barely in her 20s, with a baby daughter and a brand new marriage, when the two people she trusted most into the world are the ones who destroy her? We are going to answer all of those questions. We are going to go all the way back to the beginning, before the wedding, before Ryan, before any of this was even imaginable. And we are going to follow this story the way it actually unfolded, one chapter at a time. Because the only way to truly understand a story like this is to live inside it the way Ashley had to live inside it, without knowing what was coming, without any warning at all. To understand what happened to Ashley, you have to understand where Ashley came from. Not just the town, not just the house, but the emotional landscape she grew up inside. Because the way we are raised shapes the way we trust. It shapes who we give access to, who we believe without question, and, most importantly, who we are the last to suspect when something starts to go wrong. Ashley grew up in a working-class neighborhood in the kind of community where life moved slowly and people knew each other's business, whether they wanted to or not. She was the oldest child in her household, which meant she carried responsibilities early. When you are the oldest, you learn quickly how to read the adults around you. You learn how to manage the atmosphere of a home. You learn how to be what is needed rather than what you feel. Ashley was, by all accounts from people who knew her then, a responsible and caring young woman. She was the kind of person who put other people first without making a production of it. She was warm and open, and she had a particular quality that is both a gift and a vulnerability. She believed the best of the people she loved. She did not look for evidence of bad intentions because it genuinely did not occur to her that the people closest to her might have them. That quality is not naivety, it is trust, and it is a beautiful thing. And this story is partly about what happens to that quality when the wrong people are given access to it. Linda, Ashley's mother, was a complicated woman. That is not an excuse for anything she did, but it is a necessary part of understanding this story honestly. Linda had been through a divorce years before any of this happened, and the people who knew her described her as someone who had never fully found her footing after that marriage ended. She was capable, organized, hardworking, someone who could manage logistics and keep a household functioning. But underneath the capability, there was something that had never been properly addressed: a loneliness, a need to be chosen that had been left unmet for years, a sense, perhaps, that the best parts of her life were behind her rather than ahead. Linda was 18 years older than the man who would eventually be at the center of this story. 18 years. She was a mother. She was a grandmother to Ashley's baby daughter. And she was, at the time all of this was happening, a woman in her early 50s who had been alone for a long time, and who had, somewhere in that loneliness, lost the boundary between what was hers and what belonged to her daughter. People who knew Linda before any of this happened describe her as someone who had a complicated relationship with her own aging. She was attractive and she knew it, and she was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that time was moving forward in ways she could not control. She had watched her daughter grow into a young woman, vibrant, hopeful, at the beginning of everything. And somewhere in that watching, something had curdled. Not all at once, not in any single dramatic moment, but slowly. The way all the most dangerous things happen, slowly, quietly, in the spaces between the moments that anyone thinks to examine. None of that was Ashley's fault. Ashley did not make her mother feel any particular way. Ashley was simply young and alive and building something, and Linda was watching from a position that had begun to feel diminished. That is the emotional context in which this story begins. Not with malice, exactly, but with a hunger that should have been addressed in a therapist's office and instead was directed somewhere it had no business going. Now let us talk about Ryan, because Ryan is not a background character in this story, even though he sometimes gets treated as one when people discuss what happened. Ryan was 22 years old when he first met Ashley. She was 17. They met at a local pub on Valentine's Day of all days, a detail that would become quietly ironic in light of everything that followed. Ryan was, by everyone's description, charming, genuinely, naturally charming in the way that some people simply are, the kind of person who could make you feel immediately at ease, who laughed easily, and made other people feel funny and interesting and worth talking to. Ashley was drawn to him immediately. Most people were. He had an openness about him, an energy that felt uncomplicated and warm. He was an airport worker, a practical, grounded job, and he presented himself as someone who had his feet on the ground and his intentions clearly in front of him. They exchanged numbers on that Valentine's night, and within a very short time, they were together in the way young people get together when everything feels urgent and certain and absolutely right. Their relationship moved fast. That is one of the first things you notice when you map the timeline of Ashley and Ryan's story. Fast in the way that young relationships often do, not recklessly, not carelessly, but with the particular speed of two people who had decided they had found what they were looking for and saw no reason to slow down. Ashley got pregnant not long after they became a couple. And this is worth pausing on for a moment, because this is where the shape of Ashley's life was being set in ways she could not fully see yet. She was very young. She was in love with someone she had known for a relatively short time. She was about to become a mother. And then, 5 months after their daughter was born in the spring of 2004, Ryan asked her to marry him. Ashley said yes without hesitation. She was 19 years old. She had a baby girl she adored. She had a man who wanted to make it official. And she had a mother, Linda, who was not just supportive of the marriage, but who stepped forward and offered to fund the entire thing. $15,000. Every detail, every vendor, every element of the wedding that Ashley had dreamed of. Linda paid for it. And at the time, this felt like love. It felt like the most generous, most motherly thing a person could do. It felt like Linda saying, I am proud of you. I want this for you. I am with you. Ashley was moved by it. She was grateful in the deep, specific way you are grateful when someone gives you something you could not have done without. And so when she and Ryan sat down to plan the honeymoon, a week-long trip to a coastal area, Ashley made a decision that she has had to think about every day since. She invited her mother along, as a gesture of gratitude, as a way of saying thank you for everything, as an act of love toward a woman she believed loved her unconditionally in return. Linda accepted. And the three of them, a new husband, a new wife, and the bride's mother, went on the honeymoon together. There are moments in a person's life that function as dividing lines. Before and after, the world on one side of the line looks fundamentally different from the world on the other side, even if the physical surroundings are exactly the same. For Ashley, that line would eventually be drawn the day her sister picked up the wrong phone. But the events that made that moment inevitable had already been set in motion long before anyone in Ashley's life knew to look for them. The honeymoon was, by all surface accounts, a success. Ashley was happy. She was newly married, she was on a beautiful trip, and her mother was there alongside her. She later described Ryan and Linda's dynamic during that trip the same way she described it in general. They got on well, they laughed together, they were easy in each other's company. And Ashley, who had no framework for reading anything troubling into that ease, simply experienced it as a good sign. Her husband liked her mother. Her mother liked her husband. What could be more reassuring than that? What could be more straightforwardly positive than the two most important people in her life getting along? She felt, by her own description, like everything was clicking into place, like the life she had worked toward was finally solidly hers. They came home from the honeymoon. The ordinary rhythms of married life resumed. The routines, the shared meals, the small negotiations of two people building a household together. And for a short time, nothing seemed different. Ashley was settling into marriage the way young people do, adjusting to the new shape of her days, finding her footing as a wife alongside already being a mother. She was busy in the way that young mothers are always busy, relentlessly, physically, completely. She did not have a lot of spare capacity for surveillance. She was not looking for warning signs because she did not know there was anything to look for. And then, gradually, so gradually that she could not have pointed to a single moment when it started, she began to notice that something was off with Ryan. It was not anything dramatic. There was no single incident that set off an alarm. It was more like a texture change. A shift in the atmosphere of the house that she could feel but not quite name. Ryan began keeping his phone face down on surfaces. When it lit up, he would be quick to cover it or move it out of sight. He started taking certain calls in other rooms, closing doors behind him that he had never bothered to close before. He started going out for hours at a time with explanations that were technically plausible, but somehow did not fully account for the time. He became, in the language Ashley would later use to describe it, protective of his phone, of his schedule, of certain silences that had never existed between them before. Ashley told herself the things we all tell ourselves when the people we love begin to behave in ways that do not quite add up. She told herself it was work stress. She told herself it was the adjustment period of early marriage, that every couple went through something like this. She told herself she was probably overthinking it, that she was tired from caring for a baby, and her judgment was off. She constructed explanations that were charitable to Ryan, because she loved him, and because the alternative, the thing the back of her mind was beginning to formulate, was too large and too terrible to look at directly. She kept choosing the smaller, safer story, and in doing so, she gave what was happening more time to develop roots. This is not a criticism of Ashley. This is a description of how almost every person in her position behaves because human beings are not wired to suspect the people they love of the worst possible thing. We are wired to protect the people we love, even sometimes especially, from our own doubts about them. It was Ashley's sister who finally broke the seal on all of it, not by setting out to investigate, not by following a hunch, but by accident in the most ordinary possible way. She needed to make a phone call. Her own phone was unavailable. She picked up their mother Linda's phone, which was nearby, and what she saw on that phone in the messages, in the exchanges between Linda and Ryan, was not ambiguous. It was not a series of texts that could be explained by practical logistics or ordinary family conversation. It was a pattern of communication between two people who were deeply and privately involved with each other. Ashley's sister brought what she had found directly to Ashley, and that was the moment. That was the dividing line. Everything before it belonged to one life. Everything after it belonged to another. Ashley did not collapse immediately. People who know her describe her as someone who, when faced with something genuinely catastrophic, tends to go very still rather than very loud. She processed what she was being told with a quietness that was, in its own way, more heartbreaking than tears would have been. And then she went to her mother. She confronted Linda directly, clearly, without softening the question or leaving room for misinterpretation. She asked her mother what was going on between her and Ryan. And Linda looked at her daughter's face The face of the child she had raised, the young woman whose wedding she had paid $15,000 for just weeks earlier, and she denied everything. Not with hesitation, not with visible discomfort, but with a kind of offended composure that made Ashley feel, briefly, like she was the one in the wrong. Linda told her she was being crazy. She told her there was nothing to find. She performed injured dignity in a way that was, by all accounts, completely convincing in the moment. Ashley left that conversation shaken not just by what she now knew, but by how easily and how completely her mother had lied to her face. Then she went to Ryan, and Ryan's response was different from Linda's, but no more honest. When Ashley confronted him, when she came to him with what she had seen and asked him to explain himself, he went white, her own word, used in interviews she gave later. He went white as a sheet and refused to show her his phone. He did not admit to anything. He did not deny anything coherently. He simply shut down the way people shut down when they have been caught in something they cannot explain their way out of but are not yet ready to confess to. He was pale and he was silent and he was clearly calculating. And a few days later, he packed his things and left. He walked out of the house he shared with Ashley and their 7-month-old daughter, and he did not come back. No full explanation, no honest accounting of what had happened, just gone. Ashley was 19 years old. She had a baby who was not yet a year old. Her husband of weeks had just walked out without an honest word. And her mother was still, as far as the public narrative was concerned, completely innocent. Ashley was now holding the truth by herself in a house that had gone completely quiet, with no one left beside her who was willing to tell her what she already knew. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of hell. Rumors began to move through the community, as they always do in close-knit places, but nothing was confirmed. Ashley was trying to make sense of a situation that was still officially unacknowledged. She was caring for her daughter. She was going through the motions of her days, and then one afternoon, she was out walking when she saw her mother coming toward her on the street. And as Linda got closer, Ashley's eyes went to something she had not expected to see. Her mother had a visible pregnancy bump. Ashley stopped. She confronted Linda right there, in the open, with everything she had. All the questions she had been carrying for weeks, pressing to the surface at once. And Linda, standing on a public street with the evidence visible, looked at her daughter and told her it was a cyst, a medical condition, nothing to worry about. She put her hand over her stomach and delivered the lie with her hand, literally pressed against the proof. Ashley went home in a state that she later described as a kind of nausea that went all the way down. That night, she took every photograph from her wedding and she destroyed them, every single one. 9 months after Ryan had left, Linda gave birth. The baby was Ryan's. There was no longer any question, no longer any story, no more room for the explanations that had been offered and had already long since collapsed. Ashley's mother had been involved with her husband. It was now clear, during or shortly after the honeymoon, she had continued that involvement through the entire time Ashley's marriage had been falling apart. She had been pregnant while lying to Ashley's face on the street, and now there was a child in the world who was both Ashley's half-sibling and the evidence of the most complete and deliberate betrayal Ashley had ever imagined possible. When the truth becomes undeniable, when there is a baby in the world that makes denial physically impossible, a story like this one stops being a private family matter and becomes something the community around it has to reckon with collectively. And the community around Ashley and Linda and Ryan did reckon with it in all the messy, complicated, deeply human ways that communities always do when something this disorienting happens inside their borders. People who had attended the wedding, who had seen Linda weeping in the front row, who had watched her toast the couple with what appeared to be genuine love and pride, found themselves replaying those memories with a completely different understanding. They went back through what they remembered and looked for the thing they had missed, because that is what people do when a story they thought they understood turns out to be something else entirely. They look for the moment they should have seen it. They look for the sign they walked right past. Some people, predictably, circled around Linda. This is also what communities do, and it is worth understanding why, rather than simply condemning it. When something this morally disorienting happens, some people find it easier to construct an explanation that softens the perpetrator's responsibility, because accepting the full weight of what someone did requires accepting that people you know are capable of things you would rather believe they are not. So they talked about Linda's loneliness, they talked about her divorce, and how hard she had found being alone, and how the years had taken something from her that she had never recovered. They talked about Ryan's charm and implied, without quite saying it directly, that perhaps Linda had been swept up in something she had not fully been able to control. These explanations were not offered cruelly. They were offered by people who found it more bearable to see Linda as a damaged person who had made terrible choices than to see her as a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had done it anyway. But the effect of those explanations on Ashley was its own kind of harm, because every time someone offered Linda a softening narrative, they were implicitly hardening the expectation that Ashley should accept it, that she should understand, that she should find a way to get to forgiveness on a timeline that suited everyone else's discomfort. Ashley's family fractured along lines that no family wants to acknowledge exist. There were relatives who chose Linda, who maintained a relationship with her, who attended gatherings where Linda was present, who managed to compartmentalize what she had done in a way that Ashley could not and was not being asked to. There were relatives who chose Ashley, who cut contact with Linda entirely and made clear that their loyalty was unconditional and not up for renegotiation. And there were relatives who tried to occupy the impossible middle, who wanted to maintain relationships with both sides, who offered the kind of measured, both sides reasoning that sounds like wisdom, but often functions as a refusal to stand anywhere at all. That middle position, though perhaps well-intentioned, is one of the most isolating experiences available to a person in Ashley's situation because it communicates that what happened to her was a manageable disagreement rather than a fundamental violation. Ashley filed for divorce. The legal mechanics of ending a marriage are, in ordinary circumstances, painful enough. In these circumstances, where the divorce was necessitated by the fact that her husband had fathered a child with her mother, the process carried a particular weight that went beyond paperwork. Every legal step was a formal acknowledgement of the reality she had been trying to process since the day her sister picked up the wrong phone. Every signature, every court date, every document was another way of making official what had already been done to her unofficially in the worst possible way. She got through it. She did what needed to be done. She showed up when she was supposed to show up, signed what she was supposed to sign, and moved the process forward with the same quiet determination that had characterized her response to everything else in this story. Let us talk about Ryan's role in this more directly, because it is easy in a story like this one to focus exclusively on Linda. She is the mother, the older party, the one whose betrayal carries a particular cultural and emotional weight, and in doing so to allow Ryan to occupy a less examined space in the narrative. Ryan was not a passive participant. He was not a young man who found himself in a situation he did not understand or could not escape. He was a grown adult who had asked Ashley to marry him, who had fathered a child with her, who had taken vows in front of witnesses, and then within weeks of taking those vows, had made a series of choices that contradicted every single one of them. He had been protective of his phone. He had taken calls in other rooms. He had walked out of his marriage without an honest explanation. He had fathered a child with his mother-in-law, and this may be the single most telling detail of his character in this entire story. He never apologized to Ashley, not in the immediate aftermath, not in the years that followed, not when the full picture became public, not ever, as far as any reported account indicates, not once. Linda eventually wrote Ashley a letter. The letter was inadequate in ways we will address shortly, but it existed. It was an acknowledgement that something had been done and that it had caused harm. Ryan offered nothing. He moved forward with Linda. He built a life with the woman who had been his mother-in-law. He became the father of a child who was the living evidence of what he had done. And he did all of this without apparently finding it necessary to look at the person he had most directly wronged and say, I am sorry. That absence of accountability is its own statement. It tells you something important about who Ryan was. Underneath the charm and the easy laughter and the manner that made people feel comfortable around him, what was happening to Ashley during all of this time, emotionally and practically? She was doing the hard, unglamorous, relentless work of surviving something that most people could not fully imagine. She was caring for her daughter. She was navigating a social landscape that had become deeply complicated. She was processing a grief that had no clean edges because she was not just grieving a marriage, she was grieving a version of her mother that had turned out not to exist, and she was grieving a version of herself that had trusted both of them completely and now had to figure out who she was on the other side of that. Trust, that is not a single loss. That is multiple losses happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other, each one feeding into the others in ways that make the total weight of it very difficult to carry. People who have studied the psychology of betrayal, particularly betrayal that comes from within families, describe it as a specific and unusually damaging kind of trauma because the family is the original context in which we learn what safety feels like. When that context is violated from the inside, the damage goes very deep. It does not just hurt, it rewires something fundamental about how you understand the world and your place in it. Ashley later said, in accounts reported about her story, that the betrayal gave her trust issues she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. She did not say this with self-pity. She said it as a plain fact, the way you state the permanent consequences of a physical injury. Something had been done that could not be fully undone, and she was honest about what that meant for her going forward. That honesty, that refusal to perform a recovery she did not fully feel, is one of the things that makes Ashley's story worth telling carefully because it resists the tidy narrative arc that we often impose on stories of survival. Not every wound heals completely. Not every story ends in a place of total restoration. Some things change you permanently, and the most honest thing you can do with that reality is acknowledge it rather than pretend it away. There was a moment in this period, one specific moment that was reported in interviews and that stands out from everything else in the entire story as the image that captures most completely what Linda was actually willing to do. Ashley was out walking. She saw her mother coming toward her. She saw the bump. She said something. And Linda put her hand on her stomach and said it was a cyst. Said it out loud on the street with her daughter standing right in front of her. The lie was not a panicked improvisation. It was too controlled for that, too immediate. It was a lie that had been thought about in advance. Linda had anticipated this moment, the moment Ashley would see her, and she had prepared what she would say. She had decided on the cyst, she had rehearsed it or something like it, and when the moment came, she delivered it, with her hand pressed against her stomach, against the baby that was in there, against the evidence. There is something about that image, the hand, the stomach, the composed lie delivered to a daughter's face, that tells you more about Linda's state of mind during this entire period than any other single detail in the story. This was not a person consumed by guilt who did not know how to tell the truth. This was a person who had made a decision to protect what she had built, regardless of what it cost her. When this story became public, when Ashley gave interviews, when the details were reported by journalists, when the broader world had access to what had happened, the conversation that followed was, in many ways, as revealing as the story itself, because people responded to it in the exact ways that tell you everything about how we process this kind of moral complexity. Some people were simply outraged, fully and without reservation, on Ashley's behalf. They saw what Linda had done clearly, and they named it clearly, and they did not feel the need to qualify their judgment. Other people, and this group is worth paying attention to, found themselves constructing the same kinds of softening narratives that the local community had already constructed: the loneliness, the divorce, the years of being alone, as if these things were a sufficient accounting for what had happened. And then there was a third group, a smaller, quieter group, who looked at the full picture and asked the question that the loudest voices on either side were not really asking. They asked, who was Ryan? Because here is the thing about Ryan that gets lost when Linda becomes the central figure in the moral accounting of this story. Ryan was 22 years old when he met Ashley. He was charming, he was attentive. He got on well with Linda from the very beginning, well enough that Ashley noticed it and felt warm about it, well enough that the closeness between them never registered as a warning sign. And Ryan was the one who was present on the honeymoon. Ryan was the one who came same home and started protecting his phone within weeks. Ryan was the one who went pale when confronted and then walked out rather than explain himself. We do not have Ryan's full interior account of how this developed because Ryan, unlike Ashley, did not give interviews that addressed the details honestly. We do not know what he told himself in those early weeks. We do not know whether he experienced anything that could meaningfully be called guilt. What we know is what he did, and what he did was proceed. He proceeded with Linda. He fathered a child with her. He eventually married her, and he never apologized to Ashley. These are not the actions of a passive man who was carried somewhere he did not choose to go. These are the deliberate, sequential actions of someone who made a decision and then committed to it fully at the expense of the person who had trusted him most. Now consider the full picture of what Linda had access to when all of this began. She knew her daughter. She knew Ashley's particular relationship with trust. Ashley's tendency to believe the best of the people she loved, Ashley's deep need for her mother's approval and presence. She knew all of this because she was the one who had shaped it. Mothers are the architects of their children's emotional frameworks in ways that are profound and largely invisible. Invisible to the children, who simply experience those frameworks as reality, and sometimes invisible to the mothers too, who do not always consciously register the power they hold. Linda knew that Ashley would be the last person to suspect her. She knew that Ashley would make excuses before she made accusations. She knew that if she denied everything clearly and without visible guilt, Ashley would be destabilized by the denial in a way that would buy time. She knew all of this because she had raised the person she was using it against. That is the detail that lifts this story out of the category of a painful family situation and into something that requires a much harder kind of honesty. Linda's letter to Ashley, the apology that came eventually, the acknowledgement that something had been done and that it had caused harm, was, by the accounts of those who knew about it, a limited document. It used the word sorry. It acknowledged that Ashley had been hurt, but it did not go to the places that an honest reckoning would have gone. It did not address the honeymoon. It did not address the lie on the street. It did not address the $15,000 spent on a wedding that Linda was, at the time of that wedding, already involved in something that made the entire gesture a performance. It did not address the years of Ashley's life that had been fundamentally altered, the trust issues she had named, the identity questions she had had to work through, the experience of being a 19-year-old single mother whose husband and mother had left simultaneously for each other. The letter addressed the surface of what had happened without going anywhere near the foundation of it. Ashley received it. She did not, as far as any account indicates, find it sufficient, and that is not stubbornness or an inability to forgive. That is the honest response of a person who has been offered a fraction of what she was owed and has enough self-respect not to pretend it is the full amount. Ryan's silence, in contrast to Linda's letter, tells a different and in some ways starker story. Silence is a choice. When you know that someone is waiting for an acknowledgement of harm and you choose not to provide it, not in the immediate aftermath, not in the months following, not in the years during which that person is publicly processing what you did, the silence communicates something. It communicates that your comfort with what happened is more important than their recovery from it. It communicates that the accounting is, as far as you are concerned, closed. Whether Ryan was incapable of the apology, whether something in his character simply did not have access to that kind of accountability, or whether he was fully capable of it and chose not to offer it, the effect was the same. Ashley moved through the aftermath of this story without ever receiving from the man who had been her husband the basic acknowledgement that she had been wronged by him. She had to find a way to make peace with that, or not make peace with it and carry the anger, or, most likely, some combination of both, the way most people carry the unresolved parts of their largest wounds, alternating between days when the distance from it feels manageable and days when it sits right at the surface, and you have to remind yourself to breathe around it. 5 years after Ashley's wedding had collapsed in the weeks immediately following the ceremony, Linda and Ryan got married. 5 years after Ryan had walked out of Ashley's house without an honest explanation, after Linda had put her hand on her stomach and called the pregnancy a cyst, after the baby had been born, and the community had processed and reprocessed what had happened and moved on to other conversations, Linda and Ryan stood in front of witnesses and made their own vows to each other, and Ashley attended the ceremony. Let that land for a moment. Ashley attended the wedding of her mother and her ex-husband. She sat in a room, presumably a room with some of the same family members who had been at her own wedding years before, and she watched two people she had loved and been betrayed by make promises to each other. She said, in accounts reported about her experience of that day, that it was almost too much to bear. She used that language specifically. Almost too much. Not too much, because she bore it. She was there. She sat in that room, and she bore it. And she said the reason she went was because of her daughter, because her daughter needed to see her mother there, because Ashley had decided, somewhere in the processing of everything she had been through, that her child's experience of family gatherings was more important than her own need to be somewhere anywhere else on that particular day. That decision tells you something important about who Ashley was through all of this. It would have been understandable, more than understandable, completely reasonable for her to stay away. No reasonable person would have judged her for it. There was no moral obligation that required her to sit in that room and witness that ceremony, and yet she went. She went because her daughter needed her there. She absorbed the personal cost of it, and she showed up anyway for someone else. That quality, the willingness to absorb personal cost for the sake of someone you love, is the exact quality that Linda and Ryan had exploited at the beginning of this story. Ashley had invited Linda on the honeymoon because she loved her and wanted to honor her. She had given Ryan her full trust because she loved him and believed he had earned it. And both of them had taken that quality in her, that generous, open, cost-absorbing love, and had used it as cover. And yet 5 years later, Ashley still had it. She had been betrayed at the deepest possible level by the two people closest to her, and she had not let it take the best parts of who she was. She still showed up. She still absorbed cost for someone she loved. She had just gotten much better, as she had to, about who she extended that quality toward. Linda's comment to journalists who covered this story became, in many ways, the defining statement of her perspective on everything that had happened. When asked about her relationship with Ryan, Linda said, "We are married. We did not have an affair. We are married, and that is it." Read those sentences slowly, because they are doing something very specific. The framing, "we did not have an affair, we are married," takes the fact of the marriage and uses it to retroactively rewrite the history of how the marriage came to be, as if the legal formalization of the relationship answers all questions about the circumstances that preceded it. As if standing in front of an officiant and signing documents somehow settles the account of a $15,000 wedding, a honeymoon, a lie delivered on a public street, with a hand pressed against a pregnant belly, a daughter left alone with a baby in a house her husband had just walked out of. We are married, and that is it. That is the full scope of Linda's public reckoning with what she did. And there is something in that statement, in its flatness, its unapologetic finality, that is more chilling than any dramatic admission would have been, because it does not attempt to justify. It does not attempt to explain. It simply declares the outcome and presents it as sufficient. We are married. That is it. Ashley moved forward. That is the sentence that is easy to write and extraordinarily hard to fully appreciate the weight of. She found a new partner. She had more children. She built a life that was genuinely, authentically hers, not organized around Ryan's needs or Linda's approval or anyone else's idea of what her life should look like. She did the work that people who have survived deep betrayal have to do, the internal work, the therapy, the slow and unglamorous reconstruction of a self that had been fundamentally shaken. She came out the other side of it as someone who understood, in a way she had not understood before, the exact cost of trusting without evidence, and the exact value of the people who proved themselves worthy of trust over time rather than simply assuming it by virtue of relationship. Those are hard lessons. They cost more than they should cost, but they are hers now, fully and completely, in a way that nobody can take from her. She also said something, in interviews about her experience, that has stayed with the people who followed this story long after the immediate drama of it faded from public conversation. She said that the betrayal had given her trust issues she would carry for the rest of her life. She said it plainly, without apology or performance of strength. She was not claiming to be unaffected. She was not performing a recovery she had not fully achieved. She was simply being honest about the permanent nature of certain kinds of damage. And there is a kind of courage in that honesty that deserves to be named. It is much easier and much more socially rewarded to say that you got through it, that you healed, that you emerged stronger and more whole than you were before. It is harder and braver to say, "This changed me. Some of what it took from me, I did not get back. I am still living with the consequences of what was done to me, and I probably always will be." That is not weakness. That is accuracy. And Ashley's willingness to be accurate about her own experience, even when the more triumphant version of the story would have been more comfortable to tell, is part of what makes her story worth hearing. Now, let us pull back from the specific details of Ashley's life and sit for a moment with what this story is really about. Because stories like this one, and they exist more than we want to believe, are not just about the specific people involved. They are about something in the architecture of how we trust. We build our capacity for trust on the foundation of our earliest relationships. The people who care for us first, parents primarily, are the ones who teach us, through example and repetition, what safety feels like, what love looks like, what we can expect from the people closest to us. When those earliest relationships function as they should, they create a foundation that holds. When they fail in the ways that Linda's relationship with Ashley failed, They do not just hurt the person whose trust was violated. They alter the structural foundation on which all of that person's future trust is built. Ashley understood this. She lived inside the aftermath of it. And the fact that she found a way to build something real and good, and her own on top, of a foundation that had been so thoroughly shaken is the most honest and most important part of this entire story. The baby, the child that Linda had with Ryan, the child whose existence was the final undeniable evidence of what had happened, grew up in the space that this story created. A child who was simultaneously Ashley's half-sibling and the living proof of the deepest betrayal of Ashley's young life. No account has publicly addressed what that child knows, or has been told, or will eventually have to process about the circumstances of their own beginning. That is a weight that belongs to a person who had no say in any of it. And in the fullness of this story, it is worth holding space for that, for the people downstream of choices they did not make, who still have to live inside the consequences of them. Before we go anywhere, we want to stop and say something directly to the people watching this right now. If you have made it this far into this story, if you have sat with all of it, the wedding, the honeymoon, the phone turned face down on the counter, the bump on the street, the lie delivered with a hand pressed against it, the wedding Ashley attended 5 years later for the two people who had done this to her, then you already know that this story is not really about tabloid scandal. It is not about shock value. It is about something much quieter and much more universal. It is about what happens when the people who are supposed to be the floor turn out to be something else. It is about what survives that discovery and what does not. It is about the specific courage required to keep going when the foundation you built, your trust on, has been removed. And it is about the question that every single person watching this has on some level already asked themselves since the beginning of this video. Would I have survived it? Not just practically, not just gotten through it in the logistical sense, but survived it intact, with the best parts of who I am still present and functional on the other side. That is the question this story leaves us with, and we do not think there is an easy answer to it. Now we want to hear from you, and we mean that as genuinely as it is possible to mean it. Tell us in the comments, at what moment in this story did the full weight of what Ashley was going through land on you? Because for different people, it is a different moment. For some people, it is the honeymoon, the detail that Ashley invited her mother along as a thank you, and that invitation became the setting for the beginning of everything that destroyed her. For some people, it is the confrontation on the street, Linda putting her hand on the bump and calling it a cyst, looking directly at her daughter and choosing the lie. For some people, it is the wedding. 5 years later, Ashley sitting in that room because her daughter needed her there. Tell us which moment it was for you. Tell us what you would have done if you were Ashley. Tell us whether you believe that Linda's letter, the eventual limited apology, counted as real accountability, or whether accountability without full honesty is just a word. These are the conversations we are here to have. Every comment, every perspective, every person who takes the time to share their honest reaction to a story like this one is doing something important. They are refusing to let stories like Ashley's disappear into the scroll. They are insisting that what happened to her deserves to be examined and understood rather than simply consumed and forgotten. And before you go, we have to ask you the question that this story has been building towards since the very first second of this video. If you had been Ashley, if the two people you trusted most completely had done to you exactly what Linda and Ryan did to her, could you have attended that wedding 5 years later? Could you have walked into that room and sat down and been present for your daughter when being present cost you more than it is comfortable to imagine? We think about that question often because it asks not just whether you could survive the betrayal, but whether you could survive it without becoming someone different from who you were before it happened, without letting the damage take the parts of you that are most worth keeping. Ashley managed it. Imperfectly, honestly, with trust issues she openly acknowledged would be with her for the rest of her life. But she managed it. She kept the parts of herself that mattered, and that in the end is what this story is really about. Not what Linda did, not what Ryan did, but what Ashley did with what was left after they did it. And if you found something in this story that you needed to hear today, something that sits with you, something that helped you think about your own life, or your own experience of trust and betrayal, then share it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this one exist to remind us that we are not alone in the complicated, painful, deeply human experience of loving people who sometimes fail us in ways we could never have predicted. And one last thing. If you thought this story asked hard questions, if you found yourself sitting with discomfort at certain moments and not quite being able to shake it, then you are going to want to be here next week. Because we are going into a story that has been sitting in our research files for months, and every single person on this team who has read it has had the same reaction. It is the kind of story that makes you go back and reread certain parts because you cannot believe what you are reading the first time. It involves a secret that was kept for over a decade. It involves multiple people who knew different pieces of it and never compared notes. And it involves a moment of revelation so precise and so devastating that it changed everything for everyone involved in a matter of hours. That story is coming. You do not want to miss it. Subscribe to Never Ending Deep Stories right now if you are not already subscribed, because that video goes to our subscribers the moment it is live, and we would hate for you to find out about it 3 weeks late from someone else. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And thank you, more than anything, for caring about stories that deserve to be told.